Thank you for joining and welcome to today's event, Settler Impunity in Huwara. My name is Erez Bleacher and I'm the Communications and Membership Director of the Green Olive Collective, a binational information center and tour guiding cooperative committed to a democratic future and an end to the ongoing displacement of Palestinians. We provide communities around the world with insights into the apartheid policies of the occupation and the resources to engage in meaningful advocacy and solidarity with Palestinians. B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territory, is one of the leading and most principled human rights organizations in Israel. It is at the very forefront of human rights discourse, documentation, and analysis in the country, and calls unflinchingly for a future of liberty and equality for all people living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. In 2021, as some of you no doubt are aware, B'Tselem made international headlines and waves when it officially began referring to Israel as an apartheid regime and challenged the common perception of Israel as fundamentally democratic other than its policy of occupation. The name B'Tselem refers to a line in Genesis that asserts the inherent value of all people, and the organization is guided by this principle in everything they do. We're extremely happy and proud to have B'Tselem with us for this event. Your contributions for today's event will go to sustain our work amplifying the voices of human rights defenders and communities under attack, to combat the repressive policies of the incoming government, and to raise local and transnational awareness about the violence of occupation. We need contributions from you, our wider community, in order to cover the costs of the event and sustain future publicly accessible initiatives in support of human rights. You can donate at greenolivetours.com/contributions, which I've just put into the chat. And we will also donate 10% of the proceeds from today's event to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which provides healthcare for children in Gaza and is currently developing a pediatric cardiac surgery program in Khan Yunis in Gaza, which is truly remarkable and meaningful, life-affirming work. Roy Yellin, who will be speaking with us now, is the Director of Public Outreach at B'Tselem and will be speaking with us about the recent pogrom in Huwara and its meaning within a larger regime of violence between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Specifically, he will speak with us about settler impunity as government policy and the ways settler violence plays a key role within a larger system of inequality maintained by the government. Roy and I both actually joined a solidarity delegation to Huwara that took place on the Friday after the mob attack, which occurred on a Sunday. I was in part of the group that was stopped by the army from entering, but I'm very glad to say that Roy was able to reach Huwara and meet in solidarity with the families alongside EU diplomats and other civil society actors. So Roy, it's a pleasure to have you here with us. Thanks for your time, sincerely. And I'm very glad we can hear your perspective coming out of the last weeks. The last thing I think I'll say before passing it to you is that at the end of this session, we will of course open up to larger conversation, to questions and answers. So from this moment on, and as Roy begins presenting, everyone should please feel free to already send questions in the chat, send questions in response to what Roy is saying and the information Roy is sharing with us. And if you could just write question with a dash or colon at the beginning of your question, then I'll be able to identify it throughout the session and integrate it into the question and answer at the end. So with that, Roy, thank you again, really, and I'll pass it over to you. Are you able to unmute yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for spending the time to listen to me. Thank you, Erez, for hosting me today. Whether it's good afternoon or good evening, depends where you are, your time zone. I would like to start actually with some pictures from Huwara from the night of the pogrom to give some more context, and then I'll talk after that. I'll share my screen with you, and I hope it works. So that was just to show you a little bit of what happened in Huwara at the night of the pogrom. There were roughly 400 settlers that came around from all surrounding settlements. They were answering calls that went through social media. There were invites of graphics, so the army could have prepared for their arrival. And the footage that you've seen is mainly from security cameras that we collected. Some of it was sent out on WhatsApp between lots of, hundreds of Israelis and Palestinians, of course. But I want to place everything in a bigger context. A week before this pogrom happened, we documented an invasion of settlers to destroy cars in Huwara. Several days before that, we documented settlers coming at night with a car, stealing merchandise from a supermarket along the main road in Huwara. So this is not an isolated incident. It was the largest one documented, but it was not, in fact, like every day in the West Bank, our researchers, our volunteers document dozens of settler attacks. And I want to put it in context. All over the West Bank, there are roughly 280 Israeli settlements, out of which 150 are what is termed by Israeli as illegal outposts. That means settlements that were not approved by the planning committee, by the Israeli government, yet they receive every support they need from the government. Despite that, they are connected to the water and electricity grid. They are provided with security services by the Israeli military or by privatized security. They receive all the benefits of being part of the Israeli society, an OECD country, health services, social security, everything, despite the fact that they are living on an illegal situation, even according to the Israeli law. And that does not mean that the other settlements are legal. They are illegal according to international law, but Israel sort of kosherized or legalized them. In order to establish those 280 settlements, Israel has already took over a lot of Palestinian land. The land seizure, Israel devoted several mechanisms for land takeover. The first was declaring military zones or military training zones. So the military commander issues a military order that decrees a certain land swath as a military closed zone, and then Palestinians cannot reside there because allegedly there's a security need for it. The other way is declaring natural reserves. So being so devoted to the protection of nature, large chunks of the West Bank were declared as natural reserves. That mean that they are closed for use by Palestinians as farmland or for shepherding, for herding sheep and goats, because we need to protect nature. So that land was also taken from Palestinians. Of course, there's another mechanism which is called state land. According to a trick, like the Ottoman law that is still like kind of like part of the history of legislation in the West Bank, allows the state to take land from that was not used for agriculture, or that the people that used it for agriculture were not present for a certain amount of time, and to declare it as belonging to the state. And that means that it can be used for public use. Of course, public use is defined by Israel as used by Jewish Israelis, not by the local population, the occupied Palestinian population. And lastly, what we see in the context of settler violence is in fact just another unofficial mean of land seizure from Palestinians. Settlers are attacking Palestinians in several areas incessantly and prevent them from accessing their land. And as a result, eventually, they stop using it. And therefore, like it essentially becomes part of this like land takeover, but it's unofficial. Over the past 3 years, we've seen really like heartbreaking increase in the level of settler violence, not only in the amount of settler violence, but also the number of attacks, the severity of the attack, the level of organization of the attack, and also the level of impunity that the settlers receive from the Israeli forces. So, in fact, despite the two ways that like the two tracks that I described, one is like official, using a lot of like, you know, things that have certain level of formal infrastructure. The unofficial track is now the preferred method of settlers in order to take land in the West Bank. And we started to think about it, to see it, because of our history documenting settler violence for, you know, basically from the day one that B'Tselem was established. We witnessed on and on again the level of impunity that settlers that attack Palestinians receive. We document numerous attacks that are accompanied by soldiers. And we also note that when settlers are attacking Palestinians, the soldiers are not preventing the settlers from using violence. In fact, they use their own methods of violence in order to drive away the Palestinians. So Palestinians learn that the army is not protecting them. Calling on the police is also not an option. It's almost impossible for a Palestinian farmer to place a complaint with the Israeli police. And even if he does so, nothing will come out of it. So just by, you know, dozens of years of experience, Palestinians have stopped referring their complaints to the police. And while initially it seems like there's like an official way to take over land, in fact, what we started to see is that those two tracks that appear unrelated, in one, the state is taking over the land openly, it's using official methods, it's sanctioned by, you know, legal advisors of the military, of the Ministry of Justice, and eventually by the judges of the Israeli Supreme Court. And the settlers, what they're doing is they're kind of furthering their own agenda. Seemingly it's independent. Seemingly they're doing it without the approval of the authorities. But in actuality, we have to see that this is like receives the backing of the state, if not the support, because something that happens for dozens of years with complete impunity, with no repercussions, is actually like an unofficial state policy. And that has shifted our perception of settler violence. We now say that settler violence is in fact state violence. And we can say that also based on our assessment of the Israeli regime as an apartheid regime. part and parcel of an apartheid regime is legitimizing the use of violence, because you can't dominate one group of people, cementing this domination, entrenching it without using violence. Nobody wants to be second grade in the place they live, and they will invariably, they will resist it. And the way to enforce this thing is using violence. So if you legalize violence and you see that as a legitimate mean of controlling people, of controlling human beings, you eventually also learn to not see it when it's used. It becomes a transparent tool, and this is what happens with settler violence. In fact, this method of land takeover is even independent, they discuss it openly. In a meeting of one of the head of the settlers movement in Israel, Ze'ev Hever, he openly admitted a few years ago, it was documented, it was published in Haaretz by Chaim Levinson. In this recording, he says that if in the past an outpost had to be a complete settlement comprised of a few families and infrastructure, and we have to invest a lot of money and find a lot of volunteers to do it. Now they have a much more efficient method of doing that, and that is by using the agricultural farm method. In this way, they just have one settler, maybe with his own family, setting a caravan in an area that they want to push Palestinians away from, and those agricultural farms are used to take over huge amounts of land. One agricultural farm can take as much land as a settlement. This is according to what Ze'ev Hever said. And after that, we also tried to map those things. So in a report we published 2 years ago, which is called State Business. It's available on our website. We did some mapping project together with Kerem Navot, another Israeli NGO devoted to the protection of the human rights of Palestinians. And we mapped out the large amount of land that were taken over from Palestinians by the use of violence. I'll share my screen again in order to show you one example. So what you see here is Mor Farm. It's the two small dots. The red area around it is the land that was taken over from Palestinians just by having 4 or 5 settlers living in that area. You can see that it's much bigger than the Palestinian village that resides next to it, and that it prevents that Palestinian village from accessing its farmland. Same on the other area from Chavat HaDerech. You can see here on the side, this is really on the very southern part of the West Bank. You see this small dot is taking over all that land that prevents Khirbet Zanuta, that's a Palestinian village that is locked between that Israeli outpost and firing zone 918. Firing zone 918 is a contested area that Israel took from Palestinians by declaring it a closed military training zone. And I don't know if you know, but there's a big story now because the Supreme Court of Israel allowed the state to forcibly displace all the Palestinians that live in the area. But essentially, this place is caught between the land that was taken over by the army and the land that was taken over by the Israeli agricultural farm. To add insult to injury, some of those agricultural farms in South Hebron Hills are built inside the firing zone. So what we see essentially is when Israeli settlers want to violate the Israeli law and the Israeli declaration of where firing zone and where the army can train, it's allowed, it's possible. But if Palestinians that were there since before Israel was even established as a state, there are aerial photos of those Palestinians villages from the 40s before the state of Israel was established. They cannot reside there, and it even gets the stamp of approval by the Israeli Supreme Court to send them away. I just want to finish with something that that has nothing. I mean, that has to do with Huwara, but has to do with the region. Huwara is in the northern part of the West Bank. It's close to Nablus. And it resides on the main road that connects the south of the West Bank to the north. It's road number 60. Huwara is in an area of several super violent settlements: Itzhar, Tapuach, Chavat Ronen, Har Bracha. They are violent not only towards the people that live in Huwara and Zaatra, which are on the road, but mainly towards the Palestinian farmers in Burin and Uif, nearby Palestinian villages. And what they do there has to do a lot with a lot of it is just like plain violence, but a lot of the aspect of it is like destroying people's livelihood. So what we see is that usually we document a lot of violence there during the time of the olive harvest. Just last week, we documented the destruction of dozens of olive trees. Each year, sadly, we know that when the olive harvest season arrives, usually it's around the month of October, we know that we have to enter combat mode and that we will have a lot of work documenting a lot of incidents. A lot of those things are documented on our website. You can log on to the video section, and just if you type settler violence, unfortunately, you'll see a lot of clips published by, shot by our volunteers. So the thing to be mindful of is the fact that a lot of Palestinians are in Area C, which is the more rural part of Palestine, but that's also the area where all the settlements are. Make the living from farming, from herding, from growing crops. Their access to their land means their livelihood, and that's the way they make their money. Their access to their land is denied by Israel even before the settlers are coming. That was carried out already by the separation fence. The Israel built a separation fence inside the West Bank that disconnects a lot of Palestinian farmers from their land. In other areas, the land is so close to the settlements that Palestinians are denied access to them, or they can get there only 1 or 2 days a month and coordinate that with the army. So it's enough for the settlers to be violent during those times or to destroy the crops, the weeks beforehand. And when the Palestinians arrive to see their land, they see that already their yearly, crop of olives is already gone, destroyed by the settlers. Same goes for preventing herding land. Like, if you grow sheep or goats, you need a lot of herding land for the sheep and goats to graze. If the settlers prevent the Palestinians from getting there, it's very difficult. Sometimes it just amounts to harassment. We documented many times in the past few months the usage of drones. The settlers are taking a drone and they fly it over the herd, and the herd just is scared by the noise and they run away. And then you spend the rest of the day collecting, trying to find your sheep. I'll open it now for question and answers, because I think this is the main things I wanted to put in order to describe, to place what happened in Huwara in context.
Thanks, Roy. Much appreciated, and thanks for the insight you've given. Yeah, well, as Roy said, we'll open up to question and answers. Thanks to those of you who have already sent questions in the chat. Otherwise, people should please keep sending questions, and we'll get to as many as possible in the next while. I guess I wanted to potentially start with one that was sent that speaks exactly to the themes that you were speaking to, Roy. Bridget asked, how do settlers prevent Palestinians from entering their land? Roy, you've already mentioned several ways that they do so. And I think still for many people around the world and people who haven't seen it themselves, it can seem abstract. I'm wondering if you can say more or highlight specifically how this happens.
Yes, I can say how it happens. I will show you how it happens, in fact. I think what we need to remember is that settlers are armed. So let's just show this for a minute.
ابن الحرام شايفه اسمه مسلح.
We heard something just now, but I can't see on your screen
Can you
something.
see? Okay. I'll try again.
Take your time. Thank you.
ابن الحرام شايفه اسمه مسلح. بيضحكوا مع بعض والمستوطن. الحرام بيكنس على الشباب. هذا المشلح بيكنس على الشباب.
So I think it's enough. What we were seeing there was the guy, the bare-chested guy wearing military pants, holding the rifle, but having his head covered. That's a settler. Settlers are armed by the Israeli government. They carry weapon. What you saw next to him was a soldier. The soldier was in full military gear. So the first thing is that Palestinians know that if they even just approach a settlement, they probably won't get out of this incident, alive or uninjured. Most of the settlements are also surrounded by fences. They are protected by the army, and they also have what is called a security zone for the settlement, which is like a no-go zone for Palestinians. So every Palestinian knows that if they enter this no-go zone, they will probably get arrested or worse. Those no-go zones include a lot of farming and herding ways. So this is one of the ways that the settlements actually encroach on Palestinian livelihood is by the fact that it's not only the land that the settlement takes from Palestinians, but also the surrounding area. So basically that's the other way is that the attacks. So when a bunch of settlement, if you're you're watching a herd of sheep, it's enough to be one settler that is making a lot of noise and is violent, comes with the stick or with the knife or with the gun and threatens you and drive the sheep away. That the rest of the day you have to collect the flock. It will take you a lot of time. after several times, you will try to avoid that area. And that would happen. So essentially, like those, because of the settler violence, Palestinians know that if they go to certain areas, they will be attacked. They know that nobody will come to help them. In fact, if the army is there, it will send them away. It will not confront the settlers. It will confront the Palestinians, and they stop using that land. So that's the other way.
Yeah. Thanks for saying, Roy. And I guess to Bridget's question and to highlight what you're saying, it's exactly, with your permission, I'll add, the synergy between the settlers and the settler movement and the state that causes the context in which Palestinian land is taken. There's the direct harassment and intimidation and violence of the settlers. And then there's also the military and government policy of creating security zones, buffer zones around settlements and seizing land, expropriating it when there are settlers. I want to move, because we're getting a wonderful set of questions to speak to for the event, to a question from Javid, who asked a question related to the relationship between the settlers and the current government. Actually, Javid, I'm going to ask or invite you to unmute if you can and ask yourself. And if you can't for whatever reason, I'll just read the question. So I'm asking you to unmute now if you want to ask what you did before to Roy.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to ask this question. I was wondering, the settlers, do they have a political ambition? Like, do they want to take over the government at some stage? Is it the plan? Thank you.
Thanks, Javid.
Okay. The answer is yes and no. The settlers are the government, and have been for many years. Nothing that we see in the West Bank is the result of a fringe political movement. Everything that we see in the West Bank, in Gaza, in the occupied territories, is the result of state action and state culpability. So, in fact, yes, the no part of the action of the answer is that settlers are not the majority of Israeli society. They are at the fringe of the political consensus, yet they are the most effective political consensus in Israel. And the fact is that their vision is sort of like a continuation of the logic of the establishment of the state of Israel. But in a way that didn't stop. So if I have to say that, like, when a national movement achieves goals, it has to stop to exist. Otherwise, it becomes a nationalistic endeavor. And that's what happened in Israel. And it's not just the settlers that are responsible for that. It's also the people that built the state. So when Jewish people had no state and they wanted to have, to implement their self-determination, that's one thing. One can ask whether it was, to what extent that was carried out at the expense of the people that were here before us. But it's entirely different when this self-implementation has the power of a state and the agency that the state has in the world to change reality and to displace people and to change reality. And after 1967, Israel kind of continued with the same logic that brought to its inception of settlement, of colonizing more and more area at the expense of the people that were living there before. And the settlers were just building on what was there before them. We are now, the outcome of this is apartheid. This kind of like when you build colonies and you have one group of people that is controlling another and denying them their rights and equality and everything, basically, that's an apartheid situation. And the settlers are interested in this regime of Jewish supremacy to a degree that I think other parts of the Israeli society are not. They're more committed to this ideology than other parts of the Israeli society, but other parts of the Israeli society are perfectly okay with Jewish supremacy. And that's why the settlers were able to create their settlement, and that's why the Israeli army and government are supporting that.
Thanks. And I guess following from that question and along some other lines, I'm appreciative of the way you've framed the escalation in settler violence within a larger context of Israeli policy, of Israeli state building, going back to the foundation of the state. And yet I guess I'm curious to ask a little bit more about how either you personally or B'Tselem organizationally is assessing the real risks of this current moment with Ben Gvir and Smotrich having increasing influence and giving increasing impunity to settlers, and what it might mean for the future as part of this trajectory you've outlined.
Okay, I don't like to be an alarmist, but 400 settlers arriving to a Palestinian village at night and doing a pogrom, that's a result of this environment, this political environment. The Israel Minister of Finance, Smotrich, who's one of the head of the settler parties at the Knesset, was openly saying that Huwara needs to be wiped off the map, right? So this kind of genocidal desire was there. He took it back, or kind of half-heartedly apologized after a lot of international criticism. But unfortunately, he wrote about his fantasies and criminal desires before, and this was not a sole incident in which he said that Palestinians should go away, or worse than that. Same goes for Ben Gvir. However, so things are not looking great at the moment. And we also know that there's a lot of the Israeli government is under a lot of pressure from protest in Israel, very widespread. And their easiest way out of it is through inciting violence with Palestinians and then kind of like reuniting the Jews against the Arabs again. So this is also a very possible scenario. And we see with like the news that are coming from Jerusalem, from East Jerusalem, in the past 2 days, a lot of police violence against people that are praying, against people that are just, around because of Ramadan. That's possible that we will see this escalation of violence deteriorating in the next coming week or even days. I want, but also to be mindful of something else. 2 years ago, when we published about the Israeli regime being one of apartheid, and we were later followed by similar judgment by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, the two largest international human rights organizations, that was followed by another report by Al-Mizan, a Palestinian organization that wrote about the Aza Bantustan, and later by a group of Palestinian organizations headed by Al-Haq, also about apartheid. Our assessment was ignored by most state actors and the international community. I think this current Israeli government and the statement made by the Israeli Prime Minister on the very day the government was sworn in make it very difficult to deny what we wrote. Because Netanyahu said, and I quote from memory, so I apologize if it's not like word to word, but he said that the land of Israel in its entirety belongs exclusively to the Jewish people. That means no place for Palestinian state. So the two-state solution, the lip service, the most of the international community is saying whenever something here happens in the region is off the table. He also denied the right of statehood for Palestinians. He said that it belongs exclusively to the Jewish people. And I think in that kind of political background, it's very, very difficult to say that we're seeing something that will be resolved with the peace process and without avid international pressure on Israel to change its course. And that's the upscale that we have now. We have a lot of clarity from the Israeli government, and we need the same type of clarity and moral commitment from the international community to change that, to tackle that.
Thanks. I think that speaks exactly to a question that Robin Burgess, sorry if I'm mispronouncing names, asked in the chat. And I guess it's also the flip side of the prior question. You just addressed and I asked about the risks of this moment. I guess the next question related to the international sphere, what are the opportunities? And I guess I'm curious from your perspective and with B'Tselem and your interactions with the international diplomatic and grassroots spheres, how is this making waves? Are there shifts in parliamentarian or US electoral politics? But Robin, I'll ask you to unmute now, and invite you to ask your question yourself. And if you can't, I'll just read what you sent in the chat. So I'm asking you to unmute now, if you want to ask.
Hi, really helpful, Roy. Really good talk. My question was simply: does anybody know anything about what's happening in the background, and whether the Biden administration, not publicly but informally behind the scenes, is putting any kind of pressure on the Israeli state to control these kind of actions that you described?
I can say that there are several things that are in motion, but I can't say that we're hopeful for something immediate to happen. I think the Biden administration is signaling a lot of lights to the Israeli government, but it's not over Palestinians. It's much more about the liberal space within Israel. It's more about the judicial overhaul that this government is trying to promote. They are pursuing a vision of an illiberal space. In fact, Israel was able to disguise its policy of apartheid by using the fact that it was a liberal society. It was not a democracy, because controlling millions of people devoid of political and civil rights, that's not a democracy, what democracy looks like. But Tel Aviv has fantastic gay pride, and women are equal, and it's a free society, and you can speak, and an organization such as mine can operate still within Israel, despite the efforts of right-wing governments to limit our activity. So this liberal space kind of gave enough support for the claim that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Foolishly, this government is taking away this thing because this is not their vision. They don't want this liberal space, or maybe, perhaps, according to their judgment, it's already, they don't need this pretense. They don't need this kind of like a liberal Tel Aviv in order to cover up the reality of occupation and apartheid. So the Biden administration is engaged with that, I think, more than with other things. But they're also looking at the Palestinian issue more from the point of view of don't make anything that is permanent. So they would let Israel do a lot, but they don't want to see things that are going overboard in terms of their ability to deny what's going on, and to provide Israel with the umbrella of the automatic veto that the US has used almost always, other than like once in recent history during the very, very end of the Obama administration, to give Israel actual like political and diplomatic impunity for the war crime that it commits in the West Bank. But, this is wearing thin, and I don't know. I hope that it was thin enough, but I don't think that we're a priority for the Biden administration. I think their biggest ambition is to not engage on anything that has to do with this region. This is like not their goal. There are other things that happened in other arenas. There's an ongoing investigation in the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Palestinians joined the Rome Treaty in 2014. There's an ongoing investigation there of the Israeli violations, including the settlements. They might look also to other crimes that are in the Rome Statute. That includes persecution, the crime of apartheid, forced displacement, all of those things. And this open investigation, together with the judicial overhaul that Israel is trying to pursue here, is actually going to promote and make the investigation into war crimes easier, because in international law there's the principle of complementarity. So Israel was able to push away international repercussions for what it was doing, saying that it has a very independent judiciary and that everything goes through and that everything is legalized and there's an investigation into every violation that happens. It will be very difficult to say that when the courts are not independent and there's no investigation. In fact, very recently, this coalition was trying to promote legislation that will give complete impunity to soldiers and security forces. In fact, the interpretation of like this law, like if you read it, you say like, why do they need it? Because basically that's the situation right now. Israeli security forces act with complete impunity when it comes to violence against Palestinians. And this legislation has nothing to do other than kind of like, it's a populist move to kind of like show that they are patriotic and support the soldiers, when in fact the soldiers are already protected. And this law will only make it more, easier to indict them into international courts. So that's the uptick, that's the upside. Unfortunately, I'm not very hopeful for the Biden administration, but I have to say that there are some encouraging things that happened within the Democratic Party. Progressives understand more that if they want to be on the right side of history, they have to support Palestinian rights. They are more mindful of the situation. They are well aware that it's not symmetrical, that it's not like, two-siding the situation and saying it's too complicated, to understand that there's one side that is being controlled by the other side. And in order to have the situation resolved, control is not the option. It has to be like human rights-based approach. It says independence for everyone, equality for everyone, human rights for everyone, and democracy for everyone.
Chara. I think we have time for just another question or two before closing out the session. I saw a series of questions that were geared towards more understanding the context and reality on the ground within Israeli civil society, and also in relation to the protest. You just talked about the international diplomatic electoral sphere. On the ground, what waves are happening, and how does Huwara and settler violence, how do you see it appearing in discourse within the protests, within civil society? What opportunities or risks are there on that front?
Okay, so as you probably know, like hundreds of thousands of Israelis go out to the streets every week to protest what this government wants to do. And it's always a good thing when people are fighting for their rights, no matter if they understand the larger context or not. And I know it's kind of like a lot of my friends feel a little bit bitter about, thousands of people shouting for democracy when they don't see the elephant in the room, which is the occupation and the fact that Israel was never a democracy, and that they're fighting for privileges and not for equality. But that said, I think that having such a political discourse and fighting for rights is always a positive thing. In the context of Huwara, there are two developments which are interesting. First of all this judicial overhaul, people are doing it. Different political parties are doing it for different political reasons. The ultra-Orthodox, which are a third of this coalition, are doing it in order because they never liked the Supreme Court and they want to have, a more equality for them. Means that they can't discriminate non-Jews, they can't discriminate women. So this is for them, this judicial overhaul is, they have this aim in mind. Benjamin Netanyahu wants this judicial overhaul because he needs to flee his indictment. He has a criminal charges and he needs to appoint the judges so he gets a get out of jail card from the courts. That's his reasoning for that. But the settlers, they want to do it in order to entrench a situation of an apartheid regime forever. That's part of a larger project that they have. When in fact they legislated the nation-state law that said that the state of Israel is meant for Jews, which was the first enshrining the principle of Jewish supremacy in legislation that addresses it in such open wording, in such clear way. That was the first, the first note of like their big project. And they want to do it in order to prevent the court from addressing the situation of apartheid in the future. They want to entrench this situation forever, and they want even more violence, even more suppression of Palestinians, and also preventing Palestinians within Israel from running to the Knesset. So that's their goal. And I think the people that go to the streets understand that. And the kind of naturally in the days following the pogrom in Huwara, without any plan, or just like it emerged from the streets, people were shouting to the police, "Where were you at Huwara?" And that became like a major thing that people shout at the demonstration whenever there's a friction with the police forces. It's not driven by us, like the group that is protesting the occupation within the bigger protest. It's just from general people that go there. And I think one of the outcomes of this bigger protest, no matter what will happen with the legislation, is that more people within Israeli society will look at the bigger picture and the context of democracy and will ask themselves some tough questions. I don't know how big this group will be, but it's definitely more people than were in our ranks before.
Thanks. And of course, we all hope that this moment will continue to give opening to a broader human rights analysis and a broader vision of justice for everyone in the future. I want to ask you, as we unfortunately have to close out shortly, Roy, if you have any last words or last thoughts you want to share, and especially about what we can do, or what the role of people on the ground and especially internationals is in creating the possibility of a democratic future in Israel-Palestine.
The thing that the world needs to, I think there's, right now, Israel enjoys sort of like an exceptionalism. So it receives impunity for doing, for enacting wrong policies of displacement and war crimes. And that needs to stop. And it will stop only with a lot of international pressure. And what everyone can do that is not from here is, first of all, to share the story and change the narrative. This is what we hear from diplomats that are stationed here. They are all very, very well aware of the situation. But when we say to them, and what are you going to do? And they say, unfortunately, we can't do much because the politicians in our countries have no appetite to do more. So if you want us to do more, you have to work through civil society and grassroots activism in our, respective capitals. And if there will be political demand for action, then we will act. So this, this brings us to you people and to ask you to share stories, to talk about it, to write to your congressman or respective parliament member, and to insist on having a space for this discourse, because part of the Israeli policy is to prevent this discourse from ever happening using false accusations of anti-Semitism and blaming the victim, silencing Palestinians from ever talking, blaming people for talking, for inciting violence, etc. So just like make the space for this conversation and insist on making them, and that will essentially build a better political infrastructure for change.
Wonderful, thank you, Roy. And I hope all of us coming from this talk, and as people of conscience around the world who have seen the events of the last weeks and a long time before that, take to heart the call to action and the call to amplify the voices of Palestinians on the ground and their allies. With that, unfortunately, we have to close out for the day. Thank you everyone for the meaningful questions. And thanks again, Roy, for your invaluable perspective and time. And thanks to everyone here on behalf of Green Olive for joining this timely event. As I mentioned at the start, Green Olive depends on contributions from you, our wider community, to cover the costs of our events, sustain our work to combat the violence of occupation, and shift the needle of international opinion around the occupation. You can contribute at greenolivetours.com/contributions, which I just put into the chat once more. Your support will sustain future advocacy initiatives and the work of our incredible tour guides in Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Hebron, and throughout the occupied West Bank, who many of you have met also, I know, and every day are bringing international visitors to the occupied territories to see the reality with their own eyes, bear witness and hear testimony from Palestinians, and develop relationships with communities living under occupation, whose voices all of us can amplify in home communities around the world. Your contributions will also help Green Olive to create strategic advocacy resources, media trainings, informational films and primers, and other publications and materials whose aim is to expose the larger international community to the reality on the ground, amplify the voices of human rights defenders, and provide people around the world with the tools they need to engage in meaningful advocacy for the end of the occupation and the development of a democratic and just society. Very lastly, we will be launching at Green Olive a new membership, community engagement, and informational platform soon that will collect our resources and make them available to wider audiences in what we think are very exciting ways, and in ways we hope will empower wider communities to meet the challenges of the current political moment. We hope you will support us in this work, so stay tuned. Thanks again on behalf of all of us, and I really hope everyone here has lovely days, and we hope to see you in the future for upcoming events. Roy, have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And I look forward to more in the future. Bye, everyone. Enjoy.